Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Steve Clemens. I direct the American Strategy Program here at the New America Foundation, and I am so grateful to all of my colleagues because they've been working hard today on a set of conferences that have been here. And we tend to stream things. Hello to everybody on the New America website and the Washington Note website. But our team has really been pushed to the limit. So I just want to say thank you in advance to Mike Jones, to Ben, to Sam Sherrod, and to everyone, because we didn't really think about putting this program together until about 3 o'clock yesterday. I want to thank you all for being here. And it was my fault. And I want to thank Martin Wolf, whom I'm so grateful to, as a great friend. I don't know if I should tell the public this, but we're Facebook buddies. Martin is a very modern man. He surprised me because I titled today's event, The Bad, and the Ugly, a discussion of America's really tough economic choices ahead. And he wrote me a note back and said, there must be some good. And that must be a line I think Martin Wolf rarely utters. There must be some good. But in any case, all of you know Martin Wolf, who's associate editor and the chief economics commentator for the world, in my view, but at the Financial Times. He is without a doubt one of the world's most significant, most followed economic commentators and analysts. He's ruthlessly empirical in saying what the data show. I tell people who talk about distance learning, all you really need to do is read his column each week to have an extraordinary education on what matters and what doesn't in thinking about the global economy. He's author of Fixing Global Finance and author of Why Globalization Works. And Martin, it's a great pleasure to have you with us for a little while. I should also add that after we're done here, we're going to have a nice reception and drinks. So that's the part I really want.
That's why they're really here.
I think they're really here for you. But let me just ask you to kind of give us a survey of, you're here speaking for the Council on Foreign Relations and some other groups in Washington. I saw you at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. I could start off in a silly way and say, what do you think of Jay Leno? But what do you think about the...
This would be on the record, wouldn't it?
This is streaming live for the world, yeah. I actually said that, Barack Obama was quoted once as saying that in an interview with Ryan Leza, he said, I really am better than my speechwriters. I really am better than my political directors. I can do any job around me better than the staff. This is a Barack Obama statement. And I said, he can also be his own comedian. After the Jay Leno. But
I would tend to agree that he was a better comedian than Mr. Leno.
On that
substantially better.
So today, let's start off with the Eurozone. You wrote about this in your latest op-ed in the Financial Times, that you said until recently you didn't think that the Eurozone could ever break up, but you've changed course.
Yes, that's been a subject, obviously, of recent columns. The events of this year have been very remarkable, and I have to say they've surprised me, not in the direction but in the intensity. So very briefly, the Euro project was obviously a heroic project, a remarkable project, completely unique, essentially unique in creating a fiat money structure. Previous such things like the Latin currency union of the late 19th century were really built around the gold standard, so it was a different sort of structure in which you have many countries sharing one monetary institution with different fiscal systems and very different and divergent economies. It was clear from the beginning that this was going to be problematic by its nature. That's not very difficult to see. And it was also became clear in the course of the last decade that the economies of the Eurozone were diverging in perhaps predictable but very striking ways. That was going to make the ultimate problems of adjustment much worse. In particular, what emerged, for reasons I don't have the time to go through, is a block of core countries which became increasingly competitive over time. Very, very low rise in unit labor costs with very strong industrial sectors. Germany is, of course, the most important, which emerged with an absolutely gigantic current account surplus, the second biggest in the world after China. It peaked at, I think, 8% of GDP. And at the same time, in peripheral Eurozone, also actually in Central and Eastern Europe, in the environment of very low interest rates, much lower interest rates than these countries had ever had before, there was an enormous surge in borrowing linked with, particularly in Spain and Ireland, with an enormous housing bubble, the sort we're familiar with, that set off a real race of credit expansion, asset price bubble, huge current account deficits, and interestingly, what appeared to be in a completely comfortable fiscal position. None of the fiscal rules of the Eurozone picked this up, the point I made before. Spain went into surplus. It had a sizable fiscal surplus. Its net debt went to 20% of GDP. In Ireland, net debt disappeared. So that all looked fine. In fact, they were among the stronger fiscal countries. Then we had the Greece problem separate. They obviously disguised what was going on. So there was this colossal divergence. Now, I didn't think this would prove unmanageable because I didn't expect, I've said this many times before, in 2007 that we'd have the sort of global financial crisis we now have. Because of the global financial crisis, markets are in a constant state of turmoil and doubt about the ability of people to meet their debt obligations. And it's clear after the first round of the crisis, which was a crisis of financial institutions, this has morphed into a general concern about fiscal positions. And naturally, markets start concentrating on countries which have the following characteristics: very large deficits, very large debt, absolutely no growth, and no policy instruments to generate growth, and huge competitiveness problems. That combination. And no monetary policy levers at all. And that's basically the situation Greece is in most extremely, and people can see some of the other peripheral countries going the same direction. I think the biggest problem they have is the inability to persuade people that they can grow again, and that's fundamentally a competitiveness problem as a result of this divergence I've described. Now, so Greece then announced that its figures were all wrong. That started the panic. Suddenly, this already began at the beginning of the crisis, credit spreads blew out dramatically. And at a certain point, when credit spreads get big enough, you're in an absolutely unsustainable position. If you've got very high debt, as Greece has, about 115% of GDP, I think, and your real interest rates go to 5, 6, 7%, and you're not growing, you really have an impossible problem in managing it. And that's where we ended up. The Eurozone has, of course, had to do, felt driven to do one emergency package after another. First, brought in the IMF, I won't go into all that history, did the package for Greece, 110 billion euros. Then that wasn't enough to calm the market, so they then went to this mega thing, the 750 billion euro thing. And that's more or less stabilized the financial markets, but destabilized the currency markets. Anyway, the end result of this is they've got some very big economic problems, and the politics in Europe have now got really fraught. That's where it gets really difficult. And I think, I'll just end with this, the most important point about this was always the problem. Once you create a currency union, you share the same money, you have different fiscal systems, your politics, the way you handle your debt problems, become part of the internal politics of all the other countries. Right. And in particular, they become part of the politics of Germany, which is the most important country, where the German citizens say, we behaved well, we've had a tremendous fiscal stringency, we've delayed retirement, all the rest of it, and then now these other countries which have behaved so irresponsibly expect us to bail them out. This is intolerable. So now we have what's turned into a massive political crisis. Now you could imagine this happening between California and the rest of the US, right? We all read the stories about California. Whatever happens, California might be forced to default, but there isn't a question about whether the US Union will survive. That's not so obvious in this case. So what was an economic crisis has recently morphed into a serious internal political crisis. I won't go into other dimensions of this. There are lots of friction between Germany and France in many areas. But so now, for the first time, I'm beginning to think the political glue, which is ultimately what keeps this together, is getting quite weak. And we are at a very early stage in this process. The adjustments that will be needed to bring these countries back into the fold stably have really only just begun. So we don't know how this will play out.
Of course, I do want, Martin, you to address the U.S. economy down the road, but I want to. You have this magical way of anticipating my questions. But But I was about to get into and break in a bit ago that you stood on this stage last, I think it was September, and you said, maybe it was earlier.
It would have been last.
When we had Soros here and others.
It would have been February.
Yeah, so February, and you said
You do so many
Germany,
meetings you can't remember who
right,
you
well,
had.
running
Even with
everywhere.
George Soros.
When we were here together, you said Germany is not living up to and performing to the level of its hegemonic responsibilities in Europe, and it was a very big statement, and it got a lot of coverage here. When I saw you in Dalian, China, you made a similar, you made a comment about China and said China would never allow its currency to float or really be a challenger to the euro and to the dollar because it really never will let go control of its economy. And this, of course, is a very interesting reflection given what you've just said about Germany having fundamentally given up control of a lot of its economic realities because it's had to be responsible for everyone else's sort of misbehavior. And I'm interested in how you think Germany, how would you grade Germany's performance in the Eurozone? And can you reflect a little bit on China, which may bring us back then to the United States, since there's been this discussion of the interlinkage of the U.S. and Chinese situation?
There are two different, I wrote an incredibly controversial and very unpopular column in which I suggest we should talk about Germany.
Germany?
Germany, yes. And the parallel, both countries, I got an earful from the governments of both sides. Both governments were deeply offended by the comparison with the other. And I can give you a long list of why the Chinese were deeply offended by the comparison with the Germans and Germany, and Germany was deeply offended with the comparison with China. So I probably succeeded in my aim. Now, the only important similarity for this purpose was simply that, pretty obvious, banal point, they are huge surplus nations. They're two of the trio of huge surplus industrial nations or industrializing nations. And in a world which I think is one of chronically deficient demand at the moment, that creates a big problem because somebody has to offset this drag. And that problem with the Eurozone is now going to get much bigger, and we know it's going to be the US. So that creates a problem for US policymaking. So that's a natural lead into this, and it follows from my comment on beggar my neighbor policies from the Eurozone. You asked about the CFR lunch. I won't talk about the details, but this was with a lot of very, very distinguished economists in Washington. No one disagreed with the proposition that the Eurozone is now going to start emerging as a serious deflationary force in the world. And you just look at the fiscal policies that are now going to be imposed, and you think about the monetary policy response, that seemed pretty clear. And that has profound implications. Now, what was my critique of Germany? Well, I've since elaborated this at great length. The fundamental problem is very crude, very simple. If the strongest economy in a system, and Germany is far away the strongest country in the system, economy in the system, is a huge surplus country, i.e. it's accumulating claims on the others. Essentially, you have the situation in which the less creditworthy countries are running up debts, and the most creditworthy countries is accumulating claims. And sooner or later what will happen, which is what we've now got, I was predicting this then, is that the less creditworthy countries will start getting into default scenarios, which is where we are. And once that happens, they will contract demand dramatically because they can't borrow anymore. Where we are, they can only now borrow because of help. Germany then is put in the position it either guarantees their debts, which it hates, or it lets demand in the periphery collapse. Now, since German demand remains very, very weak, that forces the whole Eurozone into massive deflation mode. The only way the Eurozone as a whole can then get out of that is becoming a huge net exporter for the world. And in one figure, I actually did some figures on how big a net export it would have to be to offset this effect. It emerges about 600 or 700 billion euros a year. So it's a very large surplus is needed to offset this, if you assume these contractionary forces are very strong. Now, these are controversial numbers. Now, the basic point is that in a financial crisis, I used a Kindleberger point. Kindleberger argued that in a global financial crisis, the hegemonic power has to be the borrower and market of last resort for the system because it's the one that can borrow most easily. That's how it works. That's what the role the US has played in the post-war period and didn't so spectacularly play in the interwar period. So, and I argue that that's the position of Germany in the Eurozone. So when things are really bad in the Eurozone, Germany has to offer a dynamic market. It has to offer demand. But Germany is incapable of doing so. So if once it lost the demand of the periphery because they lost their creditworthiness, as we can now see, other countries now have reached their limits of fiscal deficits. France has a very big one. Italy really can't risk it at all. So they're all going to be forced into starting to contract. Monetary policy doesn't upset it. So the Eurozone as a whole goes into contracting mode. And in addition to that, well, it doesn't recover much. In addition to that, these peripheral countries find it unbelievably difficult to get out of their problem because domestic demand is smashed for reasons that are pretty obvious. The private sector bubbles have burst. The public sector has to cut its deficits very rapidly. So the only hope is exports. And the markets in that they do most of their trade, they do 60, 70% of their trade with one another, are very stagnant. So this is not a functioning system, I thought. And it's become even worse than I thought. Now, 15 years ago, 10, 12 years ago, it wasn't so obvious that Germany would emerge as such a giant surplus country, but that's the way it's ended up. So that was my point about Germany. And that's the similarity with China. In other ways, of course, they're completely different, as they insisted. China is a very fast-growing developing country. Germany is, with a very controlled system, Germany is now part of this system, which they're trying to make work. They do have another similarity, which is they actually have very weak financial systems. I mean, borderline insolvent ones, as it were, despite having very big banks, and they don't want to recognize these losses. That's very important in Germany, and also explains.
So those are bubbles that could burst.
Well, no, I think they're both solvent because the countries are solvent, so the governments can deal with the problem. But they do have weak financial systems, explains part of what they are trying to do. In China's case, the particular point you made, there are many other points to make, there's been a very long argument among people about whether China will allow the renminbi to become a convertible currency. And I've taken the view, which will probably turn out to be wrong tomorrow, that China will not allow this to happen in the foreseeable future, because once you have a fully convertible currency, you lose control over your banking system to some significant degree, and for the Chinese government, that's the principal economic lever over the entire economy. They won't risk that. That's a special facet of this problem. But I do think it is fair to say that the Eurozone's development, with Germany emerging as it has, and its relationship with the peripheral countries, has been very unfortunate for long-term stability. And it makes very difficult getting out of this problem they're in now, because there isn't a source of demand for the weak countries to go towards, except the global market, which is, in a way, what the weakening euro will help them get to. But if you look at the numbers, that means, of course, the US. So the one implication of all this is that I think that the US will have to end up running even bigger current account deficits than before the crisis hit, when the world gets back to
Could you say that a little more loudly?
I think that was what I was discussing, that one of the implications of this, if you start adding up the numbers, is with Asia going back to China sticking essentially with its model. It's clearly determined to stick with the model in broad outline for the medium term, get the export-led growth out again when the temporary thing is gone. The Eurozone is clearly going to be moving because the German surpluses will not be absorbed in peripheral Europe in the way they were. Spain was a huge offset. The Eurozone will need to go to export-led growth. So the US will have the enormous advantage of being able to borrow incredibly large amounts of money very cheaply for a very long time.
Who borrows it, consumers or government?
It has to be the government.
Yeah.
I provoke
maybe
people.
It's time for questions. Peter
Let me just say, I provoke people at this lunch by simply saying the problem with the US deficit is that it's not nearly big enough.
This is why we love Martin at the New America Foundation. I thank you. Why don't I open the floor to some questions? I was going to jokingly call on Peter Orszag, who I tried to get to come to this because he would offer the alternative, which there. But I'm very taken with Martin. I agree with Martin. But let me go to Tom Gallagher here. And do we have a microphone, by the way, since we're streaming live? Sarah? You have to give the mic to the people I say to give it to. Not that I don't want to give it to Tom Gallagher here. Okay.
Would everybody say who they are, please?
Thank you.
Yes, if you'll identify yourself, even though I've identified you.
Okay, Tom Gallagher with the ISI Group. When the deflationary forces you describe become evident, do you think that the ECB could do some genuine quantitative easing, or what other responses would you see in the policy front to weak growth in Europe?
you want me to deal with one at a time?
Yeah, why don't we take this one?
Okay,
and then we'll grab a
that was one of the issues we discussed. And my guess is, and this can only be a guess, because we really don't know, is they will probably end up there, but kicking and screaming. So, I mean, it will be a horrendous battle, an ideological and political battle. And it would only happen after it becomes really obvious that deflation is a real issue. There is a real risk if you start looking at some of the charts I showed today in my chart column, if you just look at the inflation numbers, core inflation numbers, that it is possible in these circumstances that the Eurozone will stumble into deflation, as happened with Japan. It was never planned, it just happened. And then the central bank simply reacted too slowly because it wasn't part of their mental map. And then when they really started to deal with it, to some extent tried to deal with it, they never did enough. They found it very difficult to deal with it. There is a real risk that the ECB will get there, but it will be years too late. And there are two reasons why that. First, inflation inertia in Europe is very great. It's clearly much greater than the United States. So they won't trip into, for a whole set of reasons about how contracts work in the labor market and so forth, the way they will get into deflation, if they do get into it, very slowly. It's not going to happen quickly. Even with a lot of slack, it won't happen very quickly. I'm talking about core measures. And second, then if they do, then going to more unconventional measures than they've already adopted, really, which means massive quantitative easing program, violates in the most profound way the Bundesbank tradition view of the role of a central bank. And it will be a bloodbath. I mean, intellectually, really incredibly difficult to do. As you will have seen, I'll just conclude with this, that when they bought the $16 billion worth of dud paper in the periphery, which is nothing, the Axel Weber, who was, after all, the president of the Bundesbank, member of the council, publicly, this is incredibly, publicly criticized the ECB for doing this. So my answer is they might get there in the end, but it will take a very long time.
Go back to the person, Sarah, that took the microphone from. I don't know who it was. Great.
Hi, Hani from Dakli. I'd like to get some comments about the UK that you haven't talked about in this presentation. But my question about this change in the competitiveness of countries with China having overtaken Germany earlier this year for the first time as the largest exporter, and the devaluation of the euro. And
I'm going to ask you to make your question very short.
Question is, how will the Chinese and the Asians respond to an increased competitiveness by Germany?
Okay, let's take a couple of other questions. Right here in the front. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Andrei Sitov. My question is, I'm with TASS, the Russian news agency. I'm your colleague. My favorite quote from the last session of the IMF and the World Bank was, Russia entered this crisis, Russia entered the previous crisis 10 years ago weak and came out of it weaker, but Russia entered this crisis strong and came out of it stronger. That was a quote from Mr. Gill, who is the chief economist for the region for the World Bank. Do you agree with it? If not, why not? Thank you.
Thank you. And let's go to Ode, Aberdeen in front.
Ode, Aberdeen. Sir, you mentioned that the Greek situation will become political. The politics of Greece will spill into Europe. When that happens, undoubtedly they will spill into America. How will that impact on further U.S. borrowing, as you have suggested?
Great. Okay, we'll take those three.
I'm not sure that I understood the first question, because I think you were talking about the UK and then we got to Asia. So you might have to come back to that if you want to explain it. Russia clearly entered the last crisis much stronger than in '97. It couldn't have entered weaker. Pretty obviously. Large surpluses, very good fiscal position, large reserves. In fact, in my view, and it exited it economically okay, but my own view, and this will be rather shocking, I don't understand why they had a crisis at all. I mean, there shouldn't have been a crisis in Russia at all. You've got a country which wasn't part of this financial mess per se. Well, there obviously was far too many people borrow crazily, but it wasn't in the core Western financial system mess at all. It had a huge foreign currency reserve position. It's a huge commodity exporter. It's outside. It's not smashed by the collapse of manufacturing as many countries were. So basically, I find it impossible to understand why Russia had a serious crisis at all. Given that, I can go any further. I'm not surprised that the exit is reasonably comfortable. I consider the main problems of Russia to be structural, long-term, not short-term, cyclical and financial. I don't think I need to go any further on that. The Greek crisis will affect the US. I don't know whether you're thinking about the behavior of the Greek community in the US. Presumably not. I think, yes, it has an effect, but it's all positive. I mean, look, markets are about choosing among bads in the present situation.
Just the bad, and
all nominal financial assets. Okay, above all, government debt and currencies look pretty horrible. Okay? In the sense that there is no significant government that isn't borrowing like in the developed world, that isn't borrowing like crazy, and the ones that aren't borrowing like crazy, you can't buy, like the renminbi in the relevant quantities. But in the world that we are in now, I regard that I never wrote this column, but I was going to write, we're in an ugliness competition. And in the ugliness competition, Keynes once wrote about this, I think, the question is to choose the least ugly asset. It's perfectly obvious to me, maybe not, and it seems to be obvious to the market, just look at long-term bond rates and the dollar, that the least ugly nominal asset in the world is the US dollar. Right. And the more nervous they get about everything else in the world, the less ugly it gets. And the question always is, well, if they're not going to hold US dollar liabilities, particularly treasury liabilities, what are they going to hold instead? Real assets are always possible. There are certain, you can have a huge flight into real assets when you're really worried about inflation, but inflation is no worry now, and not for the foreseeable future. It might be in the end, but not for the foreseeable future. And then you have to start yourself, well, which governments look better than the US? All the big governments are borrowing like crazy. They all have huge debt. Most countries have worse aging problems. There's this Eurozone mess, which can end up costing Germany God knows what. The French have a fiscal deficit about as big as you do. We won't talk about the UK and Japan. It has debt to GDP ratios of 200%. So in this competition, the US is the winner, and that's why everyone is going to buy dollars. I mean, the American people do want the government to borrow. They just don't want to admit that that's what they want to. They want what the American. I had a long discussion of this with a nice conservative columnist at the New York Times very recently. You can probably guess who it is. In which we all agree that the American people want to continue the spending by the government, and they don't want to pay any more taxes. This means they want to continue the borrowing, and the rest of the world agrees with them. So that's what's going to happen.
So but when you come to that, and thank you so much for validating our title of the bad, and the ugly.
No, this is good. This is good.
No, the bad, the bad, and the beautiful.
Look, here's a country, a huge country that can export $1 trillion of pieces of paper every year to the rest of the world, and it'll go on.
I agree, and it looks like that's where it's going to go. But it does create this interesting political dilemma because both the Chinese government and the American government have pretended or acted as if they have a gun to each other's head on economic rebalancing, and that we need to clean up our behavior, and China needs to grow from domestic-led growth and do more to stimulate its economy. But obviously, that is not the vision we're hearing from Martin Wolf. We're hearing from Martin Wolf, we're going to see a lot more of what we had before, and that's what's going to keep the middle class, what's left of it, the quality of life in America humming along is sort of an exacerbation.
A year ago, I hoped this is a big enough shock to start this rebalancing process. And of course, in the worst of the recession, it did start.
Right.
I now increasingly think that, in fact, we're going to move slowly back towards the status quo ante, and we will continue with this game in which we pretend to adjust, and in reality we continue as we were before, because the policy systems of the rest of the world, which we're talking about, the relevant places, China, Germany, and Japan for different reasons, the oil exporters, they continue to want to export, and the United States and actually has a political equilibrium, which seems to be much more obvious now than 2 years ago. It has a political equilibrium for running huge deficits. So in that situation, that's the outcome.
Let me take one or two more questions, and then I promise we'll break the drinks. Bruce Stokes here in front.
Martin.
You've got to. Apparently, we'll turn into pumpkins if you don't use this.
Yeah. Martin, let's assume something we probably won't happen, which is that the United States decides it does not want to go back to 6 or 7% of GDP, current account debt, and pursues consciously a weak dollar policy in a variety of ways, industrial policy, trade protectionism, whatever it needs to produce more of what's consumed at home. What are the implications of that for the world, given the current situation?
And let me jump to Marianne Stein here.
I think I'm asking the corollary, and that is, given what you're saying you think is going to continue happening, we're all reading gloom and doom statements from other people about how we can't continue to build this deficit. What do you foresee if we do continue along the lines you predict? Is there a danger point, and what should we worry about?
Okay, and then this gentleman here, right in the front. And if you'll identify yourself.
My name is Samar Chatterjee from SAFE Foundation. A question for you regarding, I'm sure you're aware that India was almost bankrupt in 1990-91, and it was no worse than what I'm sorry.
Let's just move to the question.
Okay, what Europe is in situation, but however, within 5 to 6 years, it was able to turn around. Now, what was the difference between India and, let's say, I think the European country that is in the news with lots of trouble, and I'm just forgetting that name. So, is there a difference other than the size of it?
Thank you. And if you have any comments on Yaga Reddy, that would be interesting.
On which?
Yaga Reddy. Do you know Yaga Reddy? Reddy is the very interesting former governor of the Indian Central Bank.
RBI, yeah. But
Yeah,
what,
he's
in
very
what context, what does he just
Well,
say?
I'm just sort of throwing another India. He's very interesting because
he thinks you're all crazy. Yes.
Yeah, well, he thinks we're all crazy, and he ostensibly, I met him at George Soros's Institute for New Economic Thinking conference. I tried to get a lot of people to sit in John Maynard Keynes's bathtub and to have pictures taken of them, since I figured that's where he thought through these world. But Yaga Reddy was there, very impressive, and was controversial in India for not allowing Indian financial institutions to go as deeply into the financial derivatives world as so much of the rest of the financial sector. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to extend your India question.
Okay. Okay, in order. I think that one of the things I have been concerned about for a long time is that the U.S. response to the situation would be protectionist. And I have to say that in a way, given what's been happening to U.S. employment, the policies of foreign governments and their impact upon the U.S., it is actually, to me, genuinely astonishing how weak that has been. And so I might conclude from that, this is just gone. But you've asked for the hypothesis that that the Americans will in fact elect, the next president will be Jim Buchanan or somebody with those sorts of views. Not Pat Buchanan, sorry. God, what a terrible mistake. I apologize, Jim. Pat Buchanan, or somebody with those sorts of views. Well, the answer to that is, if that were to happen, this is a game changer for the entire world economic system, because the assumption underlying the world economic system, really since the war, has been that whatever the US says about its policy, it is an open market, fundamentally hostile to protectionism, and when everything gets rough, you can rely on the US to consume more and not try to protect itself significantly from the predatory mercantilist policies of others, which I think is a correct description of some of what's been going on. So it will be a complete game changer, will be an entirely different world. It would generate a lot of hostility. The second globalization, which I wrote about, would no longer be functioning in the same way.
You once wrote that America had to remain the world's patsy.
No, I never I would never have used the word patsy.
You used something close.
Because this is an Americanism that I don't fully understand. But America has to remain the world's dumpy, as it were. Maybe that's the better.
Dumpy.
So it will be a game changer. And as I said, the astonishing thing is that this hasn't become part of the ideology. The second question is, how much can you borrow? Well, the answer to that is very, very interesting. As much as people are willing to lend, and that is a banal point, but it actually is a very profound point, because what determines how much people are willing to lend can be quite surprising. There was a famous debate, and I'll mention this in passing, in the highest public debt to GDP ratio the UK ever had was, you might think, in 1945, and it was very close to it, but actually it was in 1815 when it peaked at very close to 300% of GDP. So you're not even anywhere near it. So how could an underdeveloped country with a state which couldn't tax more than about 10% of GDP ever get to that sort of debt? Of course, the debt was accumulated in financing a long series of wars, which allowed the UK to emerge as the early 19th century superpower. And the answer is nobody understood how they could borrow so much. It was all borrowed domestically, by the way. But they could, and because they did, they did, and it was probably the single most important reason Britain won the Napoleonic War, or played the decisive role. That's a very long history. So 300%, what's America's? We're only talking about 100. I'm describing a world, and Japan is now at 200, roughly, 160 net. And Japan is borrowing at 1.5%, roughly. I'm describing a world in which I believe that the rest of the world will be willing to lend to the US because it's the least bad credit. And in that case, you can just rack up unbelievable quantities of debt. And you can actually then stop it, as the British did in 1815, and run it down over a century. But that's not likely. The normal way out of this, as we found after 1945, is with some inflation. That's the normal way. But I think it is important to understand that these processes of debt accumulation, the countries that are deemed creditworthy because they're the currency everybody wants to hold, the assets that are most liquid and all the rest of it at the time, can be absolutely astonishingly high in terms of the contemporary debate. Of course, at some point this fun ends, and the bigger the debt accumulation, the more problems you're going to have. But I think it's quite wrong to think that suddenly tomorrow, I mean, if you follow, there have been bears on the Japanese JGB markets outside Japan for the last 20 years, and they've all gone bust. As it were, you can't, anyone shorted JGBs in Japanese government bonds in the last 20 years has gone bust. And here we are, the most indebted developed country. India had a foreign currency crisis. It wasn't a debt crisis. That distinction is very, very important because India, of course, had then and does have now exchange controls. The actual debt relative to GDP was quite modest. Most of the debt was domestic, and they had a significant devaluation, significant adjustment and liberalization, which increased very radically exports and imports, increased the attractions of India as a destination for FDI, and the balance of payments problem was solved pretty quickly. These are all classic symptoms of a developing country debt crisis, external debt crisis, as a result of some rather serious but manageable policy mistakes. What we're describing here is a debt problem related to the whole economy. There's no difference between a foreign and domestic currency. In fact, they're the same thing. The debt levels are very, very high involved here, and the countries concerned grow relatively slowly, which makes debt management much, much more difficult. So I think the comparison with India, between India and the Euro countries, is not a very good one. But it is a very good example of what can be done if you're sufficiently flexible as a developing country. And maybe some of the Central and Eastern European countries can follow that route. Yes, Governor Reddy, who's a friend of mine, was convinced that everything that was going on in the Western financial markets was crazy and it shouldn't be allowed to happen to India. And he was successful and he was right. So
we're hoping to bring...
he wasn't putting up with any of this nonsense that markets know best. Now, it should be said that the idea that I worked for many years on India, that any Indian bureaucrat would willingly believe that markets know better than an Indian bureaucrat is really and truly a contradiction in terms. It's impossible to imagine any governor of the RBI taking any other view than that. And so it's the starting point of any discussion on this. But in this case, he was clearly right, and I think he saved his country where there was a lot of pressure. There was a lot of pressure, including from some very distinguished Indian academics in this country, like Raghuram Rajan, who's a good friend of mine, to move towards more liberalization, and I think it would have been a catastrophe if they had done so. I have, in my own writing, taken very strongly the view that developing countries, particularly at the earliest stages of development, should be very, very careful about all foreign currency borrowing, foreign currency denominated borrowing. Equity investment, FDI, is no problem. Foreign currency borrowing is a nightmare for developing countries unless they're very, very open and very, very flexible. So that's all fine. And I'm still not sure, unfortunately, I can't answer the other question about competitiveness and so forth, but if the gentleman wants to come up to me, I'd be happy to do that.
We'll do it over wine. I want to thank Martin Wolf. Martin, and I want to tell all of you who haven't read it, read the book Fixing Global Finance, which was published in partnership with Frank Fukuyama's outfit at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. Frank, of course, is now moving to Stanford, but the discussion and the important elements of that book, much of that was captured in today's discussion. And I'm also interested in someone who's interested in power, American power in the global system, both in its strategic dimensions, but its economic dimensions. It's become increasingly clear that America's global power position is increasingly defined by Pentagon expenditures and by the size of its debt, in which too big to fail is taking on a whole new meaning. I'm developing this. I'm glad I don't have to withdraw that thesis anytime soon, according to Martin Wolf. So with that, please join me in giving Martin Wolf a very warm round of applause. It's great to have him. And let's open the bar and have some drinks.